Welcome back pilots to another Jetworks build video. In this video we'll be doing the F-18 Superhornet. Once you've got all your stuff ready, it's bulkhead 1 and forward fuselage sides. Quite simple process. We are using the kit form here, so there's a small groove, so I'm just making sure it's nice and flush with a wee bit of sandpaper. Just test fit it up and add a small amount of glue. I'm using UHU here, whatever it is that you choose to use. So we're just meeting it up together and smudging the glue about, making sure that both surfaces have got a nice even contact. There was a wee bit less there, so I just put a wee bit on the inside. And we'll just let that dry off slightly. Now on the fuselage sides, you can see that it's already marked up, so just carefully with a sharp blade, just trimming away as much of the foam as possible just before we get to sanding. And just like I say, just carefully removing small piece by piece. Don't go in and try and cut it all in one go. Do the same with the opposite side. And then again, just a wee bit of sandpaper, just smoothing it off so we've got a nice flat even surface for the glue to adhere to. I'm just sanding it up to the line, and again do the same with the other side. So now that the glue's had a wee bit of air time, ready to dry, just offer it up to the fuselage belly, and that's that set in place. So the next part is the fuselage sides. On the corner of your bench or whatever it is that you're using, just gently pull it through and give it a wee curve to try and match up the fuselage belly to get it as close to it as possible. And do the same with the opposite side. Now there is a small curve for the belly panel, but what I will be doing, I'll be taping it up just to make sure it's matted together pretty well. So a bit of glue in the contact surfaces, and at the bulkhead one there I'm just using a piece of tape just to hold it in place. And then we'll get some more low tack masking tape, and what I'll do is I'll run it along the sides just to pull the side down onto the belly panel just to make sure it's nice and flush and there's no gaps where we'll let the glue set. The rear part I'm not too fussy about where it's going at the moment, although I'm putting a wee bit of glue on, smudging it about so at least there's some there ready to make contact, and do the same with the opposite side. Bit of glue in the tabs and we'll just rub it together so that, you know, make a nice adhesion. And then again, starting off at bulkhead 1, I'm just going to add a small piece of masking tape. Again, just hold it in place. And then working along the sides onto the belly panel. Again, another wee piece of tape. And then at the rear part, small piece of tape round the two sanded parts just to make sure we've got a nice even meet. Next steps, lower corner reinforcers and bulkhead 2. Fantastic that these as the kit form. Saves that pain of cutting the wee strips and making sure they're absolutely perfect, which mine tend not to be. So again, like we do, small amount of glue, less is better, and just smudge it along so we've got a nice even application. Here I'm putting some glue on the bottom side, and I put it in and just dropped it in there. But what I'm doing is I'm sliding it along just to make sure there's an even coating of glue along the belly panel, and then the same on the other side. And then bulkhead number 2, slot that into place, we test fit, have a look, see where the glue's going to go, and just meet it up. Allow that to set. So the next step, I'm doing the twin cockpit. So we're onto the magnet panel support pieces and the cockpit support. So on the twin cockpit, on one of the mirrored sides, just like the step before, just a small amount of UHU on it or whatever glue it is you use. Then offer it up, making sure it's flush at the bottom and the rear, and do the same with the opposite side. Once we're happy at that, the next step is to put that into the fuselage sides and the bridge panel lower. Again, a small amount of glue. You don't need much. Don't take it right to the top, as the top of it will come out above the fuselage sides. And then on the outer parts, small amount of glue, smudge it about, and then just at the rear as well, and a wee bit at the tip where it meets up to bulkhead 1. Slide into place, make sure the bottom of the cockpit support meets the bottom of bulkhead number 2, and at the front bulkhead number 1, just make sure there's just enough gap for 6mm piece of foam, and then do the same with the opposite side. Once that's in place and you've gave it a wee bit of time to cure and go off, small amount of glue just in the contact surfaces, and then we'll add the bridge panel lower. Again, just let that go off. Next step's onto the bridge panel middle, bridge panel upper. Simple, small amount of glue, slide it about in place. I have already trimmed it back and sanded them as close to how I think it should be. Again, we'll get it a wee bit cleaner when we come to final sanding of the fuselage itself. So next step's the cockpit magnet bridge. On the sides, like I say, with the laser cut, there is the smallest amount of grooves, so just sand it off to make sure it's nice and flush, and we've got a good contact surface at each side. Small amount of glue, put it in place, and what I'm doing, I've just squeezed it in so that there was any surplus glue squeezes out and just wiped it away with a cloth. So the next step's nose cone aligner and fitting the nose cone. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, I missed it on the video, so we're going to be simple enough process. I'm sure you know how to do that. Moving on to the fuselage, the rear fuselage and the elevator support pieces. So here we're using the 3-ply laser cut parts. What I'm doing, I've taped off the outer side and a small amount of epoxy. Just using 5-minute epoxy. Slide it into the hole, the locator for it. Then the second piece, just putting it in piece by piece. I did think about using CA glue, but I thought, no, we'll just go with the epoxy. So again, next step, rear fuselage sides and attaching the belly. Again, apologies for whatever reason the video file wasn't there, but simple enough process. Just attaching the sides to the sides to the belly panel. And then we've got the rear support and corner reinforcers. Like we did with the forward reinforcers, just small amount of glue, double them up and put them together, laminate them together so it's nice and strong. So just to cut the 45 degree angle, I'm just marking up how far it needs to go back for the plans. And I'm just using a wee Sharpie, marking it up, making sure that they're mirrored pieces here. Again, we're using a sharp knife and just carefully just slicing through bit by bit by bit. Don't try and go for the full cut first time. Just trying to get as close to that 45 degree angle as I can. And like I say, a few passes just to get it through and make it a nice clean cut. And do the same with the opposite side, but like I say, being sure that you cut mirrored slices so that you have not two the same but one of the opposite. So again, what I'm doing on the bottom where it meets up with the rear fuselage belly panel, so just sanding it off to make sure it's nice and flat and we have a good contact surface. So a small amount of glue right along the corner. Offer it up, and then like what I do is I slide it back and forward just to smudge the glue out, make sure there's an even contact all the way along both sides, the side and the belly itself. I did remove the wee intake templates, but I will be putting them back on. So now that that's done, these parts are for the rear fuselage joiner pieces. Can't remember the proper name, but it'll come up. And I'm just sanding them down here. As the laser cutter goes through very, very thin parts, it's actually a bit smaller than I think it actually should be. However, I made a mistake here. Chose to, as you can see, the rear fuselage sides, fuselage bridging spacer is intended to go on to the fuselage. That's why it's called fuselage bridging spacer. But what I've done here, like I say, I was sanding them down, and then for whatever reason I chose to put them on the rear. So let's just go with that wee mistake that we had made, and well, yeah, I didn't change it, I just kept going with it. So I'm just lining it up on the tail end pieces, just making sure it's nice and tight, and then allowing that to set off. So onto the fuselage bottom, the corner reinforcers, and setting it up against the fuselage itself. So just placed it up against each side. I've just scored it, lightly scored it, because grey foam's good at that. And then a small amount of glue just to highlight where I'm putting the glue on, so that I'm not putting on too much. A wee bit up against the corner reinforcers. And as you can see, we removed the slot there for the rear of the EDF mount. Smudging it about, making sure there's a good even coverage all along it. And then attaching the two pieces, making sure it's lined up nice and flush at the back. Just pressing it down. There is a slight curve in it. So the next step, installing the bulkheads and the rear. Didn't actually do the bulkheads at this point, so I moved on to the rear. And as you can see, what I've got a 6mm carbon fibre tube, sliding that in so that it's nice and flush and horizontal. Both of them are symmetrical, so put that through, and then I'm using a small amount of epoxy for the supporting piece itself. Slide that now up against the fuselage, and the same on the opposite side. Bit of epoxy on the fuselage sides itself, and then slide up the supporting piece. And then what we'll do is we'll let that go, let that cure, and in that way I can be sure that both of them are nice and straight and even, so that when it comes to adding the horizontal stabilizers, the elevators, they should be nice and flush. So on the stabilizers itself, a small amount of epoxy. I'm using 5-minute epoxy. Tape off the underside, obviously so that the glue doesn't go through the table. And I'm using the 3mm ply cutouts as well. Just making sure that the glue is at both sides. Putting the control horns. And I've got here a 6mm carbon fibre rod. Sorry, tube actually. Carbon fibre tube. And what I've done on the rear of the fuselage, we had trimmed away the 6mm tube that we had in there, so that each side I have small tubes in there, but I've got a 4mm carbon fibre rod going through it. If that makes sense. Hopefully it'll make sense as we move further on and actually get to it. So you can see what I've done is I've installed the servos at the rear. Check the EDF bulkhead fits nice and flush. And then I'm just putting through some modelling pins. Now that the glue's went off, a 6mm foam spacer at the back, and then offer up the fuselage itself. I'm just tacking it into place just to make sure it's located properly. And then the same at the front. Just putting some modelling pins in to hold it into place while the glue goes off. Certainly didn't want it splitting open. And once that's done, just allow that to cure. So going back to the rear pins, let's say I've got a 4mm pin going through, and then I've got a wee prop adapter on the back. Slide on the elevator just to make sure it's fine. Again, on the opposite side, a 4mm carbon fibre tube, and then sliding on the elevators just to make sure that they were fine. And in that way I can use that as the hinge for the elevators themselves. So onto the EDF bulkhead. I actually cut a wee relief tab in it as well, just so that we can get the EDF motor wires going through. This is a 70mm, but as you can see there, it was that thin that I actually split it. It's not the first time. But the laser cut parts, they fitted absolutely fantastic. No sanding required, I don't think. And so now that we've got it in, we've not glued it at all. We're just kind of test fitting it. As you can see, I still have the rim, the lip on the front of the EDF housing. On this FMS EDF unit that I have, the lip is not removable, so we're just leaving it on. So a small amount of Yoo-hoo on the contact surfaces. Tease the sides open, and then slide in the EDF unit and align the bulkheads to make sure it's nice and flush and level. The unit's running straight. Making sure that it's in the locating tabs on the bottom, and then we're just checking it off with the top panel itself, just to make sure that they're not leaning back, leaning forward, and they're absolutely straight, as straight as it should be. So if all being well, if the build goes the way it should be and it's lined up, then they shouldn't have any problems when we're coming to the top panel later on in the build. So here we've got the 3D printed intake, and I just trimmed a wee bit off the bottom there, due to the fact that, as you can see, we still have the EDF bell mouth on the unit itself. So I had to trim a wee bit just to make sure it was nice and flush. So again, we test fit on the back before on the top panel. Put a wee bit of hot glue on it, and then that should secure it into place. So here we are with a scrap piece of foam. Due to the 70mm unit itself being wider than the plans, the bulkhead slots for the plans. So what I usually do is, when I decide what EDF unit I'm going to use, I'll always measure the size of the can and then adjust the size of the EDF bulkheads. So what I've done is I've got a scrap piece of foam at the rear. I've just put a bit of Yoo-hoo pour all the way around it so the exhaust bulkhead meets up to it pretty well. We've got the intake itself, glued the flange against the mouth, and then just teased it into place by looking through the rear just to make sure it's lined up as straight as possible. So with the additional slot at the back, scrap piece of foam, we're just making sure that there's somewhere there that the thrust tube itself's got a nice flush flat piece of foam to be gluing towards. So on the bulkheads, just cutting a wee relief to get the servo wires through. What I did was put on the exhaust manifold, the bulkhead at the back there, just to make sure it was nice and straight and even as well, as you can see there, just so I could make sure it's nice and straight. Once everything's glued in place, and just, once the glue's cured, got a wee bit of sanding paper and just cleaned off the exhaust bulkhead itself, so it's nice and smooth, ready to go in. The rear corner reinforcers, again, just a small amount of glue on one side. Offer the two of them up, so there's a thin application of glue on both, and then slide it into place. Just making sure that it's nice and flush with the rear there. And then on the next two, what I'm doing, I'm just cutting a wee bit of relief, mirrored relief, because obviously the thrust tube itself there comes out quite close to it. So just right at the back, just cutting a small relief on it. Small piece of glue in the bulkheads. Then again, thin beaded glue along the corner reinforcers. Offer them up so it's a thin application, and slide it into position. Try and make sure it's nice and flush at the back and nice and flat on the top as well. So a small amount of glue on the contact surfaces, and then a wee bit around the thrust tube as well, and then slide on the exhaust bulkhead. Everything seems nice and flat and flush, so I was quite happy with that. Rubbing the glue off my fingers. Ready for the next step, which is the wings. The wings itself, and once the wings are done, we'll move on to the strakes. So as you can see with the kit, the wing comes in two pieces. So a wee bit of tape on the underside, mix up some epoxy, slide it into place and make sure it's nice and flush on both sides. A wee bit excess epoxy on the top and just smoothing it out just to make sure that it's bonded very well between both. Once that's done, we'll let that cure, and then we'll move on to taping up the wing itself for the spars. And again, unfortunately, battery died on the camera while filming it. Too busy just cracking on with the build and never actually noticed that the camera had missed out the next step. Simple enough though, you know, mixing up some epoxy and then adding some micro balloons just to spread it out a bit. And like we do, you know, put it into the slot where the carbon fibre support's going to go, and just tease it out to the edges to make sure that everything's covered. So like I say, we missed that step, but simple enough. Once that goes in, let it cure, and then we're moving on to the ailerons. Here I'm just using some hinges, some tape hinges, and just marking up on both where it is I'm going to cut the wee slots to make sure that, you know, they go in nice and even. Do the same on the opposite side, and then halfway through where your markings are, I'm just cutting a wee slice into the wing itself, the aileron, where the markings are, and then same into the wing. Cut a 45-degree angle just so that it moves nice and freely. Small amount of glue on the tabs, and then slot it into the aileron itself, into the wee slices that you've put in place, the wee slots. Again, just working along, making sure that they're in nice and secure. And then we'll let the glue cure a bit. Do the same on the opposite side. It doesn't take a lot of glue at all. It's just a small amount, and then force them right in, making sure that they're there. So now that that's done, and we're happy that the glue is cured on them, a small amount of glue on the tabs itself, and then locate it in the wing, and gently ease it into place. It can be tricky at times, but should be fine. And then do the same with the opposite side as well, and then get your ailerons in, and in that way the wing's finished before we actually put it onto the build itself. For those eagle eyes, you can see the rear fuselage sitting up there. So obviously we did the wing prior to the installation. So now we're going to put the wing into the fuselage itself and then work on the strakes. So with the markings on the bottom of the wing from the laser cut kits, fantastic. Small amount of glue on the contact surfaces there. Offer up the wing into place. Now there was a wee bit of a gap here between the front and the rear, but what I did was I shoved the wing back to butt up against the rear of the fuselage, and then what I've done is I've just lifted it off the table just so that I can make sure that the markings on the wing panel, using a modelling pin, just pulling out the sides and making sure that they're in location to the marking on the wing plate itself. As you can see there's just a tiny wee gap, so we're just pulling it out, putting a wing panel in. Sorry, a modelling pin. Slide into place and all the way along it, just to make sure it meets up nice and even, same as the other side, while we'll let the glue cure. Move the junk to the side, let it dry. So the next step is moving on to the strakes. So what we've done, we've put one of them on there, and a simple process, small amount of glue in the locator tab at the top. And what I've actually done is at the rear, I'm just putting a small bead of hot glue just at the end there where it meets up the wing, so that it sticks and it's flush and I'm not waiting on that curing. Onto the wing strakes itself, small amount of glue all the way along it, smudge it about so there's a nice even application, and then offer it up to the fuselage, sorry, the wing itself, and slide into place. And I've just lined up the curves with the rear fuselage itself. Then again here onto the next one, bit of glue and smudge it about so it's the thinnest application you can get. There's none that oozes out. And then offer it up, and then onto the final piece, put that on as well. So the next step's the fuselage top support panel at the back there. So we've cut out and sanded the slot just for the groove of the thrust tube, and we'll offer up the wee support piece at the back there and just let that cure. And then we're getting on to putting the fuselage top onto the model itself. So once we've tidied up the wires and we've got everything in place, I've actually installed the aileron servos and stuff as well. I'm just sanding off the back just to make sure it's nice and flat and flush, so that when we get to gluing it, it's a nice even matting surface and we get a good adhesion. I love sanding. Yeah, and in this way you're just making sure you get the best bond whatsoever, best that you can. So once we're happy that it's nice and flat and flush, I'm actually moving on to the elevators here before we decide to put the top on. As I've got the wee pins at the back here and the pins itself move, what I've done is I'm holding it from the inside, putting a small amount of thin CA on the rod itself, and then holding it from the inside and sliding on the elevators, and that way they'll bond. So back to the top again. Now that the elevators are in place, we're just putting some glue, Yoo-hoo pour along the contact surfaces of where it's going to meet up with the fuselage, along the bulkheads itself as well. At this point, get a wee bit of tape just to tidy it up and help get them through the wires so that I'm no missing any and struggling. A wee bit of glue along at the exhaust bulkhead and along the top of the rear fuselage itself. Pull the wires through the relief and then slide it over the the EDF bulkheads itself. There's a wee bit of relief there I needed to cut due to still having the EDF bell mouth on it. And then I'm just using a couple of modelling pins at the back, tacking it in as there's a slight curve goes off to the exhaust. So next step's the turtle head bulkheads. Now that I've got the wiring in place, got the receiver and stuff in, ESC's all wired up, ready to go, just cutting the relief for the ESC. Just test fitting to make sure I'm happy with it, that it's going to fit in quite alright. Trying to make sure there's no stress on the wires, it's nice and free as well. So onto the bulkhead at the back there. Wee bit of glue, put that into place, and I've split the cables down, fed the wires back through. Bulkhead at the front. A wee bit of hot glue on the bottom, just so it's an instant tack, and I'm happy with that. Once I've cut the sizes and I'm happy that the ESC is going to slot in pretty well, just using a wee bit of hot glue and sliding it into place. Now obviously there's no airflow going over this one as we would normally have in the EDF builds. is quite hidden there, so I'm just using a wee heat sink just to help try and dissipate any of the heat that's in there, because you know it's an F-18, it's going to be flying at an 80 knots. And then check out the wirings, put it all back together before we start moving on to the bulkhead. So the turtle deck itself, just making sure you've got the mirrored parts lined up and they're in the right place. Happy with how it looks. And then we get a wee bit of glue. Again, thin application of glue, smudge it about, offer up, and just make sure it's nice and flush at the top and at the front. Once we're happy at that, mirrored sides, mirrored pieces, ready to go on to the fuselage itself. So gently curve the turtle deck sides, and then it'll be the turtle deck top. So now that we've got the fuselage together, just offering up to see how it looks and make sure that you know we're quite happy with it. Test fitted with the turtle deck top. Obviously there's a bit of wiring in there, so again just scoring along with the wee screwdriver. I've got some glue on the fuselage, a wee bit of hot glue on the bulkheads, just again to hold it straight into place so that it bonds pretty quickly, and hold that in until the hot glue goes off, and then you're sure that it's going to be stuck to the fuselage. And at the back I was just lining them up to make sure I'm happy where it goes down. The turtle deck support piece, small amount of glue, put that into place, and then again just a light sand on the top to make sure it's nice and flush and flat before we put the turtle deck top on. At the rear we've sanded it back down as well. Small amount of glue along the turtle deck sides. And here I'm just smudging it about so there's an even application along it, having a wee look to see if there's any parts that's missing, and then just put on any glue that you think you may need. And as it curves down to the rear, again what I'll do is I'll put a couple of wee modelling pins in place just to tack it down and hold it, just so it doesn't pop up. However, as it's contact glue, if you absolutely give it the time to air dry before you put it on, you probably no need to use modelling pins. So here we've got the 3D canopy. I'm just marking it up as to where it's going to go because it will take a bit of sanding. And again, you know, this part here with the bulkhead too, sand it off, make sure that you're happy with everything. Sand off the jet itself because we're pretty much close to there before we move on to adding the vertical stabilisers. So as you can see, I've done all the sanding that I need, smoothed it off as much as I can, and then we're on to the vertical stabiliser. So I'm mixing up a bit of epoxy into the slots, and there was a fair amount of epoxy. I actually dug out a wee bit of foam just to make sure that there's plenty space for the vertical stabiliser tabs to go in. There was a couple of wee lumps when I test fitted it. Again, a wee bit of 5-minute epoxy along the vertical stabilisers itself. Just on the contact surfaces, I want to make sure these are nice and strong. As you can see, I've got a balsa leading edge, and I've also put the 3D printed parts on the back just to give it a nice finish. Maybe even add a wee bit extra weight to the tail, so when you know play about with the battery in the bay a wee bit more. So what I've done, putting the jig in place, and I'm using a couple of modelling pins just to hold it in place, just to make sure that it follows the line of the jig. Once the glue goes off, just squeezing it down into place. Like I say, it's 5-minute epoxy. Once I was happy that was set, I just mixed up a small tiny bit more the 5-minute epoxy, and then in the wee slots where I seen a wee gap, I just added a wee bit extra. Yes, probably does add a wee bit extra weight, but in terms of the amount that's going to go in, I'd much rather have it nice and flush and flat and strong than worry about, you know, maybe an extra gram of epoxy. And in this way, I'm making sure the vertical stabilizer's good and strong for those high G maneuvers we're hoping to pull. But yeah, fantastic build so far. The kit, absolutely amazing. I put a wee bit balsa leading edge on the tips of the wings as well. And again, a wee bit extra epoxy just at the front. There was a couple of wee gaps there. And when it comes to painting and stuff, you know, it will give me a nice seal so there'll not be any gaps either. But it's been a great build, pretty quick build due to the fact that it was, you know, in kit form. But yeah, fantastic build. This will be my second Superhornet. Can't wait to get this one airborne as well. Apologies for a couple of steps that I've missed out. You know, there's the 3D printed exhaust on the back as well. I'm pretty sure parts of these steps that I've missed will be simple enough and easy enough for you to do. Now that we see this, I still need to add the exhaust. We've put on the balsa wingtips. I've actually put on the intakes, 3D printed intakes as well. So again, pilots, sorry missed a couple of steps, but I hope this has helped you in your build. Here's mine, looking absolutely fantastic. I'm looking forward to seeing yours as well. So thanks for joining us in the build video, pilots.